My name is Irene. My married last name is Skolnick. My maiden name was Rinde. I was born in Poland, southeastern Poland to be precise, in the province of Galicia and the city of Przemyśl. My family lived in my father's hometown. He was the youngest of 7 children. My mother's family was much smaller. She was the youngest of 3 sisters. And she's the only one who survived of her family. I had and have an older brother, 2.5 years older than I. My grandfather was a very successful entrepreneur. He had a factory which manufactured industrial products and mechanical toys under license from Germany. And he had a large merchandise store in the center of the city, which my father managed. We were one of the wealthiest families in town. I was 2 years old, so no memories of pre-war. Whatever I know is what I was told, what my father talked about. Life was very easy, very comfortable. I was 2 years old when the Nazis invaded Poland. I am fond of saying that in Poland, unless you were prescient to leave before the invasion or very shortly after, there really were only 4 ways that a Jew could hope to survive. If you were lucky, you survived the concentration camps or labor camps, certainly not the extermination camps. You could escape from the ghetto and go in the forests and survive there. And there is a very famous book describing one such episode called Defiance. It was made into a movie. If you had a Christian friend who was willing to take a risk and hide you, like Anne Frank's family attempted to do, that was a third way. The final way was really to pretend that you were Catholic. Take an assumed name, get false papers made, and try to pass yourself into the ambient community. And that is how we survived. Most of our goods were confiscated. Everything was government property. The factory, the store, personal property, because they were acquired on the brow of maltreated workers. So that by the end of the year, December, January 39-40, pretty much everybody in the family moved to Lwów. The Germans called it Lemberg. It's more to the east. It's a bigger city. And my parents were less well known, so they could hide, as my father liked to say, our criminal past. We lived there until Germany in June of 41, having conquered pretty much all of Europe, attacked the Soviet Union. And that is when we came under Nazi occupation. That was late June 41. Because the major battle of World War I took place in Przemyśl, my grandparents moved the whole family to Vienna for the duration of the war, with the result that everybody became fluent in German. And that, of course, became very useful and very important once we came under German occupation. Once we came under Nazi occupation, life changed drastically. All the anti-Semitic laws kicked in. In September, the edict came out that all Jews 12 years and older had to wear an armband white armband with a blue Star of David, under penalty of death. All German orders were always under penalty of death. Well, my father's middle sister didn't feel she needed to wear it. She didn't. She was stopped by a Ukrainian youth, asked to see her ID. The ID, of course, indicated that her nationality was Jewish, asked for a bribe, not an exorbitant one she could have afforded quite easily, but she didn't feel she needed to. Stood up for her rights, thinking she still had some. He took her to the German post. Although Ukrainians and Poles were on the take, and you could bribe them to let you go, not so the Germans. They believed in their mission, and once you were in their clutches, it was extremely rare and extremely difficult to get out of them. She started appealing to be ransomed, and my grandfather initially would not come up with the money because he dismissed the notion that a cultured people like the Germans would execute someone for such a trivial offense. Until her appeals were becoming dire, he relented. There was no go, and at the end of the month, as the prison became overcrowded, prisoners were loaded into a truck, taken to a forest, and executed. For all the culture of the German people, the Nazis meant what they said. The Germans really meant to exterminate the Jews and to accept that as a fact. We've seen a lot, but when you push yourself back to that time, as much as Jews had 2,000 years of being persecuted, it was never for the goal of extermination. This was the first time that this notion was introduced, and it took a long time for most Jews to recognize and accept it. When we had to move to the ghetto, and of course space was very limited because the Germans kept crowding that limited section, my father found a friend from Przemyśl who was a physician, married but no children. And my father found a 2-bedroom apartment which we shared with that family. Life became more and more difficult. One of the first things that the Germans did is food was rationed. In war, food is always rationed. Under the Russians, food was incredibly tight. That's when we first started suffering from hunger. It doesn't matter if you're poor, if once you were rich, because always you had some wealth. And in the case of Polish Jews or European Jews, when they have money, they converted that into gold or jewelry. And that is essentially how we survived the war. It was all my mother's jewelry and the gold coins that my parents had. And during times of shortages, there's always a black market. So if you have money with a black market, my father was always able to source an adequate amount of food so that although food was limited and difficult to come by, we really were not starving. Where starvation did set in to the ghetto in fairly short order because the Germans allocated only half the caloric values to Jews as opposed to the Polish citizens. The next big challenging fact to recognize was that Germans acknowledged that killing Jews through bullets was inefficient. Inefficient and costly. Costly both in terms of the bullets, the weapons, but also was costly on the psychology of the soldiers who had to carry out the executions, the mass shootings. And so in their search for a more efficient way of exterminating the Jewish population, they decided, as we now know, on gas chambers and cremation. And the first gas chamber that was built to test the concept was Belzec, not far from Lviv, sort of based between Lviv and Lublin, the two great centers of Jewish population at the time. And so in March of 1942, 33,000 Jews in Lviv were to be deported, allegedly for resettlement, for labor in the east. The Germans were very clever, and they were particularly excellent at deceiving the population. They had very nice euphemisms for what was going on. Press, of course, was controlled. Rumors began to fly as to what had happened to these Jews. They were going to be the guinea pigs for the gas chamber in Belzec. Clearly, nothing of this scale and horror could not go without some evidence. And once again, this belief on the part of the majority of the Jewish population, or the Germans won't do anything like that. No, the people of Bach and Beethoven and Schiller, you just don't. My mother believed it. My mother was a very suspicious woman, and anything whiff of bad, she believed it. And that is when she came to the conclusion that yes, Jews have been discriminated, and there were pogroms and people suffered, as my father argued, and he said, we'll survive this also, no, we'll manage. She said, no, this is different. They are out to kill us, and we've got to get out. And her solution was to go area. The culmination happened in early August. There was a deportation scheduled in Przemyśl. Certain people were exempted from deportations. If you were an important worker contributing to the war effort, you received a stamp in your identity papers that exempted you from roundups. My two uncles in Przemyśl, one was a physician, and that qualified him for an exemption, for him and his wife. My other uncle, even though he was working for the Germans in the factory, didn't qualify. But he had money. And there was a graphic designer in town who could design a counterfeit stamp for money. And that's what my uncle did. My Uncle Henry got the stamp for himself and his wife. My grandparents couldn't do it. Not that they lacked the money. On the face of it, they wouldn't have qualified for it. So you see, so it wasn't just the ability of being able to afford it. It had to look kosher. They used their resource to procure themselves with cyanide pills. And the eve of the deportation, ingested the poison, went to bed together in their bed, never to wake up. It was that news that my father received the next day that flipped him. With his parents gone, he told my mother, all right, I'm with you, I'm willing to take my chances. I am at the teacher's house, and her nice, kind neighbors take a look at me and says, what is this child doing here? Where does she come from? I bet you she's Jewish. And they confront the teacher and give her an ultimatum. You don't get rid of her, we'll report you to the Gestapo. Well, the teacher doesn't have much of a choice. So in the morning, she takes me to the principal's apartment, who stands her ground. Says, I don't dare to have two children. Take her back to her parents. By the time she walks me back to the ghetto, my parents are gone. So as she and I stand there not quite knowing what to do, I'm 5 years old, and I see people jumping out of windows and crashing at our feet on the stone pavement. We were sharing that apartment with that couple. And as this is going on, the couple comes home. Initially refused to let me in, so we don't want the responsibility. But under the threat from the teacher, you don't take her, I turn her over to the first SS at the exit of the ghetto, because I don't know what to do with her. So they relent. I enter the apartment, and within, I think, 25 minutes or so, the SS is banging on the door, everybody out. We are lined up in the street. The woman tells me to run away. I run away. Thankfully, I was caught by the Ukrainian who was guarding the rear of the lineup, takes me back to the couple, yells at her. We're loaded onto a truck, we're taken to a transit camp right outside the ghetto. And it is there that the doctor presents his documents, certainly shows his credentials, that he's a physician, works in the local hospital, that his wife is a nurse, and that I'm his child. They called the hospital, verified the fact that yes, indeed, he works there, and it was in great style, in a very nice horse and buggy. We were taken to the hospital. My father's oldest sister was, by now, a widow of the chief rabbi of Lviv. She had a telephone. In the morning, the doctor called my aunt to say, hey, your niece is with me, get word to her father to come and get her at the hospital. So while all of this is happening to me, my parents have their papers modified, curfew is upon them, they decide to go back to the principal's apartment to beg a night's lodging. And as they arrived there, they learned that I was taken back to the ghetto. The next morning, the principal had the school's janitor go to the ghetto to look for me. He came back saying, no trace, our apartment building was emptied, no one knows what happened. My mother's in distress, my father won't accept the obvious, and he decides to go to his younger sister's workshop to see if she knew something. And as he arrived there, the phone call came from the older sister with the news. So I'm reunited with my parents, and that's when my mother makes a decision, we'll never split up again. The fate of one will be the fate of all. My mother had a cousin who had an arrangement with a German officer of honey processing, a situation where we hid for the 2 weeks that the deportation lasted. At the end of the 2 weeks when the deportation ended, well, now we had to move, we had to go somewhere. Travel was perilous because under the Germans, Jews were not allowed to use public transportation. My parents were afraid they'd give themselves away. So they were looking for a Pole who, for money, would sort of shepherd them out. My father's younger sister had sort of been working along those lines. She had made contact with one that was not as extravagantly expensive, but he did not look very trustworthy. Well, my mother went, interviewed him, spoke to him, said, okay, we're going with him, paid 50% ahead. 8 o'clock, he was going to come and get us. 1 little suitcase per person. He said he was going to take us to Lublin, where he posited that he had contacts that would help my father get established. Why he picked Lublin, my parents never found out. He knew no one in Lublin. Lublin, for historical reasons, was decreed by the Germans. Anyone in Lublin needs special German permission. And Lublin was the site of Majdanek, the second largest concentration camp in Poland. The one big benefit of having the Pole take us was that he knew not to take a direct main line train, because that's where there were very frequent document checks. So he took us roundabout a little shuttle. We arrived in Lublin, and now what do we do? This is now where my father really stepped in. He got irritated at the Pole. He was reading a newspaper. So how can you relax and read a newspaper when we're in such a dire situation? Except that he noticed in the paper an ad, the Polish Business Association was looking for students for a bookkeeping course, because as Jews were eliminated from the Polish community, they were short of accountants and bookkeepers. And so they started this course to train them. So my father suddenly quickly realized, that if he signs up for the course, he has a legitimate reason to settle in Lublin. Next luck, he walks into the office, and the president of the Polish Business Association is a former classmate of his. And the man doesn't bat an eyelash, doesn't say anything, doesn't even make the connection, oh, we're from the same city. Very nice, very courteously signs my father up, and my father proudly walks out with his first real, authentic piece of identity. We were directed to a cheap rooming house, several beds in one big room, and no privacy of any sort. Of course, you have to register, right? My parents give their documents to the landlady, and she comes back and she says, "Are you married?" And my parents says, "Well, yes, of course we're married. Why do you ask?" Says, "Well, under what name should I register you?" In his hurry, when the counterfeiter was modifying my father's Polish ID, he flipped 2 letters in his last name. Or my mother is Kroczykowska, my father is Korczykowski. What more proof would one need? The Pole, who was still with us, half inebriated as was his habit, he grabs her and starts waltzing with her and makes light of it, and my father says, doesn't matter, you decide which one you use. She doesn't say anything. And in fact, later on, when my father needed papers from the Labor Department, her daughter had a very high position in the Labor Department. She was very helpful. There were Poles who chose to look the other way. It's one thing to ask someone to risk his life for you, and it's something else just to say, just look the other way. Don't collaborate. Don't be complicit. One of the things the Germans did when they occupied the country, they issued their own identity cards. My father did not have a German ID. So my mother, with her perfect Aryan looks, went to Warsaw, where, number one, she had a contact to sell a diamond to get some cash, and she had a friend who was going to introduce her to a counterfeiter who would create a German ID for my father. Warsaw was a very dangerous city to be in because there were a lot of Jews doing what we were doing, and Poles were on the prowl for them. So as my mother walks down the street with her friend, they get stopped by a young Polish policeman who asks to see their IDs. Her friend produces his German ID, and the policeman sneers at it. "Ha! And how much did that cost you?" And mentions the exact amount that a fake German ID costs. But my mother understands that she better not produce her ID, and she produces her Polish ID, upon which the policeman gets angry. He says, "What are you doing this? What are you showing me this for? The German's been here for so long, where's your German ID?" And she says, "Well, I'm not from Warsaw. I am from further east, and the Germans haven't been there as long, and they didn't get around to issuing IDs to everyone," which wasn't the truth, but he did not know that. He pockets the two IDs and he says, I think you better come with me. The friend tries to protest. My mother says, come on, here's the law, we obey. But as they walked a little bit, she says, well, actually, where are you taking us and why? And he says, well, I'm taking you to the police station because I suspect that you are Jewish. Whereupon my mother burst out laughing and in an Academy-winning performance exclaims, that's a good joke. Wait till I get back home and tell my friends the adventures that befell me when I visited the nation's capital. And her act was so good that the policeman just suddenly doubted his instincts, gave them back their papers. He let them go. That was my mother.
Moja brama zamykana na 102. Moja brama zakichana old Moja śliczna, moja bramusia, wszystkich pochnie i nikogo nie puszcza. Moja brama, będzie żyła i zabyła na 102. Moja śliczna, moja bramusia, wszystkich pochnie i nikogo nie puszcza. Moja brama, będzie żyła i zabyła